The British press this weekend has been full of the news that the King at his coronation is going to abandon the traditional dress of the sovereign, what they call breeches and stockings, and instead will wear the uniform of an admiral of the fleet as he arrives at his coronation. Apparently, breeches and stockings are old-fashioned and a military uniform is much more modern and less stuffy. Really? Well, there is one single example of a precedent for this, the coronation of King William IV, who also wore the uniform of an admiral of the fleet with his coronation robes over it. It was not a popular move, and at the time people called William's coronation a half-crown nation, as it was all rather cheap and tawdry, and the mistakes of it were not repeated. I may well be wrong, but personally I think this is all a load of balderdash, and the press are inventing things as the palace are being tight-lipped about the preparations for the coronation in May. I think we will probably see the king in the traditional dress. Anyway, I felt this news item gave an opportunity for me to talk about the different garments the king usually wears at the coronation and what they all mean, for they all have a symbolic meaning. The dress of the sovereign, although splendid, is not designed simply to be old-fashioned and archaic, but to express what we as a nation understand our sovereign status to be and what happens to the sovereign in the course of the ceremony. And it's also designed, believe it or not, with a certain degree of practicality in mind. Military uniforms are simply not practical in this ritual context. So what of the breeches and stockings that the press are harping on about? Well, this is the traditional base layer of the sovereign at the coronation. In the late Middle Ages, the sovereign would have worn two garments that were more or less ordinary dress, although they were elaborated to reflect his status. In the late Middle Ages, England had what were called sumptuary laws, and certain types of cloth and fur were reserved only for the king and the nobility. The king would have worn on his legs what are called hose, which were a type of tight-fitting trouser that was attached to a waistcoat called a doublet and held up by it by what were called points. Over the top of that, he would wear an overgarment called a surcoat that came down to just above his knees, sometimes slightly longer. Sur means over, coat means outer garment, so a surcoat is an overcoat in effect. And all of our sovereigns up to King George VI, except William IV, have arrived at the coronation wearing a surcoat of cloth of gold with a red coloured base to it, or one of red silk decorated with gold braid, and breeches and stockings or hose. Now, over the time, the hose developed and turned into those two garments. The breeches, which are a form of baggy trouser that comes to just below the knee, and are then covered with the stockings that cover the lower leg and calf. Now, these are rather archaic, as at the beginning of the 19th century, breeches fell out of fashion in favour of trousers and were only kept for use at the royal court, which is why our 20th century kings wore them as many others did at the coronation. Now, an update that I could see being made, one that would make real sense, is for the king to abandon the use of breeches and stockings in favour of trousers under the surcoat. Now, when the king arrives at the abbey, he additionally wears other garments. He wears over the surcoat the robe of state, which is also called his parliamentary robe. It is the robe that the king will wear with the imperial state crown at his first state opening of Parliament. Now, this is the state robe of King George III, to give you some idea of what this looks like for a king. As you can see, it has a long train of silk velvet, a cape of thick ermine over the top, and is decorated all over with gold lace. Now, over the top of this robe of state at the coronation and at the state opening of Parliament, the king wears the collar of the Order of the Garter. the most venerable English order of chivalry, of which he is already sovereign, and this represents his status as a knight and an upholder of the values of chivalry. On his head, as he arrives at the abbey, the king wears not a crown, but a red velvet fur-trimmed cap called the cap of maintenance. The cap of maintenance is a symbol of the king's legitimate royal authority. Originally, caps of maintenance were given to English sovereigns by the Pope, and King Henry VII and King Henry VIII both received them. They were usually carried in royal processions as a symbol of royal authority. In fact, at the state opening of Parliament to this very day, a cap of maintenance is carried on a wooden pole by a peer before the sovereign in the procession. Now, the king cannot wear a crown at this point, as he is yet to be anointed as sovereign, but he is already legally the king, and the robe of state and the cap of maintenance, this red robe and this red cap, reflects the reality of his status. He is in the abbey to be consecrated to his great office and will more fully enter into what that means, but the robes he wears on entry to the abbey reflect that he is already exercising the royal prerogative and has the royal authority. The king continues to wear the state robe with the cap of maintenance on his head for the acclamation, for the taking of the coronation oath, and he wears it right up to the anointing with holy oil, at which point he takes these off and is then seated in St. Edward's chair for the anointing, wearing only his scarlet surcoat. Perhaps it's just me, but I can't imagine our king wearing a military uniform for his anointing. It is such a solemn ritual, and it would be terribly jarring to see the juxtaposition of a moment of supreme religious symbolism with medal ribbons. I'm sure people felt that after the coronation of William IV, which is why the experiment was simply never repeated. Plus, there are practical considerations. The king is anointed with holy oil on his breast. A light surcoat is easily opened to allow the archbishop access to perform his anointing, but the coat of a heavy admiral's uniform with its many buttons and the garter sash would make this task at this point more difficult and really quite undignified. After the anointing, the king is invested with a whole series of additional garments that go over the top of the surcoat. Again, with this, just for the sake of physical comfort in the warmth of a May morning, I think an admiral's uniform would be impractical for our 75-year-old king. The king is firstly dressed in a white robe called the Colobium Sindonis that covers his surcoat and falls to his ankles. The name of this garment means sleeveless tunic of fine linen, and it's a tube of linen with armholes. It's a bit like the white baptismal robe that catechumens in the early church wore and the albs that priests wear to celebrate the Mass, and it probably derives from the alb, as the other garments then added over it are also priestly. They are sacerdotal in character. Over the top of the Colobium Sindonis, the sovereign wears a garment called the supertunica, which means the overtunic. All these fancy names just describe what these garments are, not what they mean. The supertunica is made of cloth of gold, and it's possible that this garment originates in a tunic that once belonged to Edward the Confessor and was therefore a holy relic. In form, the supertunica looks like the vestments called dalmatics and tunicals, which in the Middle Ages were worn by subdeacons, deacons, and also bishops under their chasubles, their mass vestments. The supertunica is girded at the waist with a belt. The present supertunica was made for the coronation of George V in 1911. Over the top of this, the sovereign is invested with another garment. the long, narrow, scarf-like vestment called a stole. This too is a sacerdotal garment worn only by priests and bishops. The king in May has a few stoles to choose from, as it was the tradition to have a new one made for every coronation, and indeed a new one might be made. This is the one used at the coronation of George VI in 1937. So when the sovereign is crowned, in the traditional medieval understanding, an understanding that still continues to the present day, kings are given a quasi-priestly role, and these three garments reflect that. At their anointing and at their garbing in these robes, they are set apart as God's vicegerent on earth. The last garment placed over the top of all of these is the coronation mantle, referred to in the coronation rite as the imperial robe. It's again made of cloth of gold. The present coronation mantle was made for the coronation of George IV in 1821 and is embroidered with emblems of England, Scotland and Ireland, the rose, the thistle and the shamrock. However, after the coronation of Queen Victoria, this mantle was snaffled by the Dean and Canons of Westminster as a perquisite, and then it completely disappeared. When King Edward VII was crowned in 1902, they therefore had to make a new mantle. When the 1821 mantle reappeared later in the decade, it was acquired by the Crown, and George V, George VI and Elizabeth II have all worn it at their coronation. So the King has a choice of two mantles to wear in May. Wearing all these garments, dressed as a priest king, the king will then be invested with all the regalia. He'll be crowned and then enthroned. Some words on why this mantle is called the imperial robe. It's important to note that English kings since the later Middle Ages have considered themselves to be emperors and to hold the imperial dignity. What that means politically is that the kings of England understood themselves to be totally independent and not under the overlordship of any other king or emperor, that they were equal to any emperor on earth. And this mantle, which is worn by our kings in imitation of the robes worn by other emperors, expresses that claim visually to imperial status and dignity. Now, if you want to know more about the concept of England as an empire, watch my video on the imperial state crown, where I go into some depth on that subject. It is important to stress that this form of dress and this concept of the English king, the British monarch as an emperor, goes back to the late Middle Ages and to medieval English kings, and long predates the now defunct British Empire. No claims are being made at the coronation of our sovereign that our sovereign has colonial imperial power. Now, at the end of the coronation, the king goes into St Edward's Chapel behind the high altar of the abbey, and he takes off the mantle, the supertunica and the colobium sindonis and St Edward's crown, and is then dressed in robes not of red but of purple. He puts on a new surcoat of purple silk decorated with gold, and over that he wears another robe called the robe of state. This is not to be confused with the robe of state that he wore at the beginning of the coronation, as they have different functions and forms. The robe of state, which is only ever worn at the coronation, is made of purple rather than red velvet. It's trimmed with ermine and it's decorated with gold lace. With this purple robe of state, the king also wears the imperial state crown with its purple cap of maintenance within it, and holds the orb and the sceptre with the cross in his hands, symbols of his direct authority to rule his kingdom under God. Now, the use of purple at this point instead of red robes is perfectly intentional. In the Byzantine Empire, purple was a colour, due to its great expense, that was reserved only for the use of the Byzantine emperor. People in the past understood this symbolism in a way that we perhaps do not now, unless you watch my videos. The British sovereign on leaving Westminster Abbey is therefore deliberately shown to the people as the person who in the British political imagination he is, an anointed king who has the dignity of an independent emperor. So they are all the changes of clothes at the coronation. None of these things are random, and it's difficult to see how many of them could be left out without the ceremony losing some of its purpose and meaning. Each garment put on and taken off has a symbolic meaning. Each change of robes expresses both a theological, a religious and spiritual point, and also a political point about the status and the independence of the British sovereign. Thanks very much for watching. If you enjoy my channel, don't forget to subscribe, to like and to share. If you want to support my work, there are a number of ways you might be able to do that. By purchasing or subscribing to my magazine The Antiquary. There are links below in the comments box as to how to do that, and a print or a digital issue comes out every month. You might like to support me in other ways by becoming a patron via Patreon, by using Buy Me a Coffee or PayPal. There are links to all three of those in the comments box and also on the homepage. Thanks for all your support, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye for now.